Hello everyone. Please gather round in my study, close to the fireplace, because I have a long story and extraordinary epic to tell you tonight. The Aeneid, the Roman equivalent to the Iliad and Odyssey, that will take us from the ruins of Troy, conquered and destroyed by the Greeks, to the foundation of the antiquity's greatest empire by a group of Trojan fugitives led by Aeneas. There will be adventure, love, God's interventions, fights, prophecies, and even a journey to the underworld. I will also tell you about the author of the Aeneid, the structure and posterity of this work, as well as its cultural and political significance. But let's begin immediately with the first chapter of our story, one that will take us to Troy at a moment when the Trojans thought they had won their 10-year-long war against the Greeks, but in reality they were in great danger of losing everything. Let's light a fire as we get on with our story. You know the Trojan War, as it was told in the Iliad and the Odyssey. All the kings and cities from Greece, the Achaeans, gathered to attack the powerful city of Troy on the other side of the Aegean Sea. But Troy was well protected behind its walls. It was defended by heroes and even supported by some of the gods, like Poseidon, Neptune to the Romans, Aphrodite, Venus, or Apollo. The Trojans resisted. It seemed the city would never fall, as the Greeks could not force its fortifications, and the attackers were losing patience, threatening their coalition after 10 years of fruitless attacks on Troy, until King Ulysses came up with a plan. The Greeks built a large statue of a horse on wheels, and suddenly, overnight, they abandoned the beach under the city's walls, or so it seemed. Only one man stayed on the beach as the Greeks pretended to sail away, Sinon, one of their warriors. His mission was to convince the Trojans that the Achaeans had abandoned the fight and that they had won the war, and also that the horse was an offering to Neptune, the god of the seas and also the master of horses. But this was obviously a trap. The horse was empty, and inside it were King Ulysses and a group of warriors, hidden, waiting for the Trojans to drag the horse behind their walls. The Trojans hesitated. The Greeks were nowhere to be seen, and what risk was there to accept a wooden statue, a gift to one of their protector gods? Sinon could convince them that accepting it would grant them the favors of Neptune, and that they would be able to conquer Greece if they did. But after 10 years of merciless war, the Trojans had their doubts, especially a priest of Apollo, Laocoon, who saw through the Greek plot and urged his compatriots to destroy the horse immediately. As he was hurling his spear at the horse, two serpents sent by the gods suddenly emerged from the sea and devoured him, which the Trojans saw as punishment for disrespecting the offering to Neptune. In fact, the gods had sent the snakes, but not to help the Trojans. They had decided that Troy shall fall, and this required the Greek plot to succeed. Impressed by this divine intervention, the Trojans dragged the statue behind their fortified walls, and they began to organize festivities to celebrate their victory. After nightfall, as the Trojans were oblivious of threats, as they thought nothing could happen behind their walls, the armed Greeks emerged from the wooden statue, where they had remained hidden all day, and they opened the city's gates. In silence, the Greek army had returned, and now stood ready to enter the defenseless city. As these events were unfolding, one of the Trojan princes and heroes, Aeneas, was sleeping at his house. Aeneas was of the highest Trojan nobility. His father, Anchises, was a prince of Troy, and his mother was goddess Venus herself, who always loved and protected her son. Aeneas had fought bravely all along the war, and protected by his fighting skills and his godly mother, he had survived. That night, as the Greeks were starting to invade the city and slaughter the Trojan guards, the Trojan hero Hector appeared to him in a dream. Hector had died recently by the hand of Greece's most formidable hero, Achilles. And in this dream, Hector's ghost urged Aeneas to immediately flee the city with his family. The gods had made plans, as they used to, and they had decided that Troy would fall. But in the negotiations between them, Venus had obtained protection and a future for her son. A future actually so brilliant and extraordinary that the name of Aeneas would stay immortal, and his deeds would be celebrated for centuries, like the ones of Hector, Ulysses, or Achilles. But for this fate to happen, Aeneas needed to escape the destruction of the city. At first, he refused and tried to fight the enemy. But the cause was lost, and Trojan warriors were falling, one after the other, as more and more columns of fire and smoke rose from the city. Aeneas witnessed the murder of Priam, the old king of Troy, by Epirus, the son of Achilles, and he accepted that the war was lost. Ulysses' plan had worked, and trickery had defeated honor. Venus appeared to her son and led him back to his house, where his son Ascanius, his wife Creusa, and his father Anchises were anxiously waiting. They all accepted to try to escape, and discreetly took the direction of the city's gates through the chaos that Troy had become. When they reached the open gates, Aeneas realized that Creusa was no longer with them, and he went back into the city to look for her. But he only encountered her ghost and understood that she had perished. The ghost of his wife, inspired by the gods, told him that he should follow his destiny. He would travel to Hesperia, the western land, go through struggles, temptation and perils, but ultimately kingship and a new royal spouse awaited him there. Desperate, almost broken by the cruelty of life and the gods, Aeneas was close to renounce to his own life after losing his city and his wife. But his son had survived, his father too, and with inspiration from his divine mother, he found the strength to rally a few other survivors and flee from the burning city. The world was ending. The Greeks were now celebrating their triumph, but the survival of Aeneas and his companions were the seeds of a new empire, one that, by the will of the gods, would surpass anything the Trojans or even the Greeks could ever have imagined. In many generations, the creation of Rome and its extraordinary destiny would be the phoenix rising from the ashes of Troy. As Aeneas and his companions are about to embark on a long adventure, take a moment to adopt a comfortable position and relax. As always, you can close your eyes at any time, since no visuals are necessary to follow the story. And it is totally fine if you fall asleep. There are timestamps in the first comment to help you resume later, where you left it. You can also listen to my stories on streaming services like Spotify or Apple Music if this is more convenient for you, or if you don't want sound effects in the end, like the crackling fire sounds in this video. Or you can listen as a podcast, or you can download the stories on Patreon if you wish to support the channel financially. Apart from what you get specifically on Patreon, your support helps keep the videos on YouTube free of annoying ad breaks for everyone, and you are most welcome if you wish to join my Patreon. You decide how much you wish to contribute, from $1, €1 or £1 a month. But for now, let's resume our journey with Aeneas and follow him all the way to Italy on his adventures. After their escape from Troy, the survivors hastily built a fleet of ships and decided to accompany their new leader, Aeneas, on his travel to the western land. Even though they were a small group of refugees, the gods were closely looking at them. On their side were the protectors of Troy, like Neptune, Venus, and Apollo. Others were neutral or even hostile, like Juno, Hera to the Greeks, the queen of gods and wife of Jupiter, Zeus, or Minerva, Athena, the traditional protector of Greek heroes such as Ulysses. Under the eyes of the gods, the expedition began wanderings across the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. To begin with, they landed in Thrace, near Troy, where they found the last remains of another Trojan warrior and hero, Polydorus. Then on the island of Delos, a holy sanctuary of Apollo and his twin sister, Diana, the patron goddess of hunters. Delos was welcoming and peaceful, and the group was tempted to stay there after the exhausting ordeal they had just gone through in Troy. But Apollo told them to leave, as it was not the place the gods intended them to colonize. So they resumed the journey and sailed south to Crete, where they thought they had arrived to their destination. And so they started building a settlement, a future city. But as soon as they began to build it, they were struck with disease. Apollo appeared to Aeneas in a dream and told him that this was the wrong place. This was not the western land of Italy, and they should leave Crete immediately to resume their journey. Left with no other choice, they abandoned the settlement and sailed away from Crete to the west. On their next stop, in small islands west of Greece, they met a harpy, a monster, half bird and half woman, that occasionally feasted on human flesh, but also was wise enough to avoid attacking the protégé of Venus. She ordered them to leave her island immediately and made a prophecy for Aeneas. They would reach Italy one day in the future, but they wouldn't find it until hunger forced them to eat their own tables. And with this gloomy prophecy, they resumed their wanderings, this time landing in Epirus, north of Greece. They were not the only survivors of Troy. Others had managed to escape and traveled to Epirus in today's northern Greece and Albania. There, another group of survivors from Troy had begun to build a city that replicated Troy, and they hoped that this city would give them a second home and cure their homesickness. In Epirus, Aeneas met Andromache, the widow of Hector. Andromache had also escaped Troy, and was still mourning the loss of her husband and their son. She had suffered as much or even more than most of the Trojans in the war. But despite all the pain, she had remained a model of fidelity and virtue. She was accompanied by Helenus, a son of King Priam of Troy, who had the gift of prophecy. And yet again, a prophecy was made. Helenus revealed that not only Aeneas' descendants would prosper in Italy, they would also rule the entire world. But Epirus was still not the promised land for them, and the group resumed their journey. As I mentioned before, not all gods who watched Aeneas' expedition were benevolent. Among their enemies was Juno, Hera in the Iliad and Greek mythology, the wife of Jupiter. Juno was against the Trojans and Venus because she had been humiliated long before. before the Trojan War, three goddesses had appeared in front of Prince Paris of Troy and competed for his preference. And at this moment, the chain of events that later led to the complete destruction of Troy began. Paris had been tasked to choose which of the three goddesses should receive a golden apple gifted by the goddess of discord. This was a poisonous gift. The apple had been gifted to no one in particular. It came with just the instruction that it should be the property of the most deserving goddess. And three of them considered it should be theirs: Juno, Minerva, and Venus. Paris had had to choose between them, and to seduce or convince him, each goddess promised extraordinary rewards: kingship and power for Juno, strength and glory for Minerva, or the love of the most beautiful woman in the world for Venus. Paris had chosen Venus over the two other ones, because the highest reward a man could hope for was eternal and perfect love. And so he had been promised Helen, the Greek queen, that he took to Troy, prompting the beginning of the war. Venus had sided with the Trojans, whereas Juno and Minerva were on the Greek side for these reasons. To most, the death of Paris and the complete destruction of Troy would have been enough of her vengeance, but not to Juno, who was able to hold grudges for a very long time, and had never been very good at forgiving anything, from the judgment of Paris to the infidelities of her husband. And so, after all these years, Juno was still angry and jealous at Venus, and kept plotting against the Trojans. Another reason to stop them that appeared when the gods had accepted that Aeneas and his companions would travel westward and lay the foundations of Rome, is that it was said that one day Rome would be the rival and destroyer of the city of Carthage, Juno's favorite city. And for that reason she saw the prophecies in favor of Aeneas with even more displeasure. And so she had decided they would never reach Italy, never found a new city, and she would get her true revenge against Venus. The moment for her to strike was approaching. The expedition had come closer to Italy, but wasn't there yet. They were approaching Sicily, the large island to the south of Italy. There they went through other adventures near Sicily, like Ulysses nearly at the same time. They were caught in the whirlpool of Charybdis, a particularly dangerous place where boats were taken in a strait between an immensely powerful whirlpool, Charybdis, and a sea monster, Scylla. As a result, they were driven out to sea and travelled away from Italy, only to come ashore at the land of the Cyclops, giant one-eyed creatures that were as stupid and mean as they were strong. They narrowly escaped Polyphemus, a Cyclops that Ulysses had wounded and tricked shortly before on his own trip back to his kingdom. And after that, Aeneas' father, Anchises, died of old age, and the fleet was suddenly taken into an unexpected storm. Juno had chosen this moment to finally unleash her wrath. Juno had no power over the seas and the winds, and so she had approached Aeolus, the king of the winds, and asked that he released the winds to stir up a storm. Aeolus had no reason to obey her and take sides between the gods, so she had to offer him a bribe. Juno reigned over several lovely sea nymphs and offered the loveliest of them as a wife to Aeolus. The king of winds found the price sufficient and accepted the offer. Soon, the fleet of Aeneas that was trying to sail back towards Italy saw black clouds form above their heads. Winds began to blow chaotically from every direction, and the storm devastated and scattered the fleet. The Trojans were saved only by the intervention of Neptune. The god of the seas had been infuriated by Juno's intrusion into his domain, and he calmed the waters to save the desperate fleet from sinking. The ships could regroup and take shelter on the coast of Africa, near a recently founded city, where a powerful queen reigned. The city was Carthage, and its queen was called Dido. You remember that prophecies had been made. Carthage would later become a great imperial rival and enemy to Rome. But who could have believed that, when Carthage had just been founded by a group of Phoenicians who had created this settlement far from their homeland in the east of the Mediterranean? And Rome did not even exist yet. After a while, and as the crews were repairing the ships and looking for food, Aeneas decided to venture into the city of Carthage. He knew that Juno was the patroness of Carthage. She had a temple there, and he hoped he could appease her by showing his devotion. In the temple of Juno, he met for the first time the queen of Carthage, the lovely Dido. And at first sight he liked her, if not more, and sought her favors. The memory of Creusa, his lost wife from Troy, had not entirely faded away yet, but after so much loneliness, the beauty and grace of Dido had awakened a flame in him which he thought had entirely disappeared forever. Dido was a widow too, and she was not insensitive to the looks and bravery of the Trojan warrior. Venus knew that the expedition needed respite before resuming its journey, and what better protection and help than the Queen of Carthage's? So she once again called her son Cupid, the little god who could inspire love in humans, like she had called him years before to make Helen fall for Paris. Cupid took the appearance of the son of Aeneas, who was part of the expedition, Ascanius. Disguised as Ascanius, he went to Dido with gifts, and Dido responded with a banquet given in honor of her Trojan visitors. During the banquet, Cupid secretly inspired fresh love for Aeneas in the heart of Dido. The threads of a tragedy were coming together. The two were attracted to each other, but separated by prophecies that pitted the young Carthage against the future Rome. How would the other gods react to this impossible love? We will see soon how events unfolded, but before that, let's take a look at the Aeneid and its author, Virgil. What is this work about? It was written over a period of 10 years, at the turn of our era, between 29 and 19 BC, when Rome had already begun its impressive expansion as a military, cultural, and political great power. Politically, there was also a transition from the old republic to an increasingly imperial system in which the institutions of the ancient republic officially stayed in place, but supreme power was moving into the hands of hereditary emperors. At the time when the Aeneid was written, the new emperor was Augustus, successor of Julius Caesar, the one who defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and all his other rivals to concentrate all power in his hands. Years of civil war, the fall of the Republic in all but name, and the devastation this had caused had torn through society. People were craving stability, and maybe their faith in the greatness of Rome had been put into doubt, eroded, because Rome was no stranger to civil wars, but its republican tradition was very ancient and historically successful. If you are interested in these political and historical aspects, I'll put a link to the 3-hour story about the history of Rome in the description. Augustus was well aware of this, and he wanted to consolidate his power and restore pride and traditional Roman values as a way of giving a sense of continuity and political unity behind him, of course. The Aeneid was written and sponsored by the highest authorities in Rome, with all that in mind. It was not the only reason, it is a work in its own right, but from the start it was seen as serving a purpose. For a part, it was propaganda, even though the premise is that it tells the story of the founding of Rome. It was never presented as a history book at all. The Romans were well aware that it was myth being forged, being fabricated. But it doesn't mean it was not efficient. By turning a hero with high moral values into the founder of Rome, and even linking him to the ruling dynasty, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. We will see that later. Virgil hoped to create a remarkable work, but also to galvanize his readers, to re-inject a sense of greatness, of epic, of duration in the mythology of Rome. A well-known and actually older story about the founding of Rome is the story of Remus and Romulus. And Virgil does not eliminate them. He integrates this anecdote into the epic, together with numerous pre-existing characters and tales from the Greek and Roman traditions. Because obviously Greek culture was very important to the Romans, not just the literature with works like the Iliad and the Odyssey that they knew perfectly. The religion, architecture, language, logic, philosophy, the way of looking at the world, all of this was well known and part of the cultural baggage of educated Roman citizens. They had ambivalent feelings towards Greece. There was a great deal of admiration and acceptation of this cultural heritage, but also a sense of being different and somewhat more successful as a civilization. It was Rome, not Greece, that had conquered the entire Mediterranean world. And at the end of the 1st century BC, pretty much all the ancient Greek world and a large part of the empire of Alexander the Great was already under Roman administration. The Aeneid reflects all this. It is clearly strongly inspired by the works of Homer, full of references to Greece, and yet the ancestors of the Romans in the story are the Trojans, the enemies of the Greeks, that finally got their revenge many centuries later. This was a characteristic of the Romans. They often glorified their enemies, the kingdoms they conquered, because obviously the fact that they had prevailed could only improve their own sense of greatness. They did it with Carthage and their successive opponents along their expansion. But the Aeneid is more than a propaganda work. It is also a massive piece of storytelling and poetry. It comprises almost 10,000 lines, and even though today it is somewhat less famous than the Iliad and the Odyssey, you don't see that many movies or TV shows directly inspired by the Aeneid, for example, and the characters are probably less famous. But it was not always the case. Until the modern period, the Aeneid was at the center of scholarly culture, and it was seen as a masterpiece of antique literature in the Middle Ages and the early modern times. Probably the most important original work in Latin. It was to Latin what the Odyssey was to Greek. And the story itself was still well known and taught to pupils until the 19th century. A lot of elements from the antiquity were reintegrated into Western culture along the centuries, in novels or plays or operas, and the Aeneid kept being told through this. Just if we look at operas, one of the most famous pieces by Henry Purcell, the English Baroque composer, is Dido and Aeneas, or there is a 19th century opera by Hector Berlioz called Les Troyens, the Trojans, which retells the story of the Aeneid. Now, the chronology of the work is not exactly as I'm retelling you the story. Another thing that Virgil took from the Greeks, from Homer, is the structure. It is not chronological, but it begins in the middle of events, in medias res in Latin. And then we learn of past events through flashbacks, when characters tell their stories to others. It was the case in the Odyssey, for example. It begins by the end, or almost the end, when Ulysses' son, Telemachus, is looking for information about what happened to his father, since he left the siege of Troy years before. And then we learn what happened to him until the end, when it comes back to the present and Ulysses reconquers his kingdom and his wife. It makes the story more dynamic, and when it was told, rather than read, in the antiquity, it must have made it even more captivating to the audience. But maybe an unfortunate consequence, though, is that when you read the Odyssey nowadays, you have to start with arguably the least interesting part of it, or at least in terms of entertainment value. And this may have made many generations of readers abandon the book before they reached the most entertaining parts. In the Aeneid, Virgil solves that by starting at the point where Aeneas and his ships are taken in the storm created by Juno. Indirectly, she asked Aeolus to send the winds for her. So we are immediately thrown into the middle of action. And then the Trojans land for repairs on the coast of Africa near Carthage. They meet Dido, and Aeneas tells her everything that has happened to them since their escape from Troy. This is how we learn everything I just told you. After that, the story becomes linear again, and we follow Aeneas from Carthage to Italy and the struggle to lay the basis of Rome. There are 12 chapters or books in total in the Aeneid, and we have only gone through 3 of them. So let's resume the story because there is still a lot to discover. Dido and Aeneas had fallen in love in Carthage, and Juno saw the opportunity to strike a deal with Venus. She would let Aeneas alone if he could stay with Dido. This way he would be distracted from his destiny of founding a city in Italy, and Rome would never exist, never rise, so that her city, Carthage, would not be destroyed. And Venus was inclined to accept because she cared for the happiness of her son. He had already suffered so much since the fall of Troy, and she was willing to give him some respite at least. The Trojans liked their stay in Carthage. They were ready to go, but they stayed to enjoy Dido's hospitality, and their leader showed no hurry to leave. One day, on a hunting expedition, a storm drove Aeneas and Dido to a covered grove, where they made love for the first time, and both were so happy to have found each other that they desired nothing else than get married and spend the rest of their days together. Venus and Juno observed this with satisfaction, but the other gods were displeased to see Aeneas forget the destiny they had decided for him. So Jupiter sent his messenger, Mercury, to remind the Trojan prince of his duty. And our hero was reminded of the tragic dilemma he was facing. Fulfilling his duty would be at the cost of his happiness and the happiness of the woman he loved. He hesitated But Aeneas was not one to reject the call of duty or go against the gods, and unable to face his lover, he left clandestinely at night, his heart broken by the decision. Dido's heart was equally broken when she discovered it, and life had lost all appeal to her. She committed suicide by stabbing herself upon a pyre with Aeneas' sword. Her last words were to predict eternal strife between Aeneas' people and hers. And so in the flames of the pyre, where her body was turning to ashes, another prophecy started to be fulfilled. Rome and Carthage would forever be archenemies, and only the destruction of Carthage would end this rivalry. Once again, men would be toys in the hands of the gods. But Aeneas had chosen duty over personal interest, and had proven worthy of the destiny he had been assigned. The journey resumed. They sailed north and returned to Sicily, not far from where the storm sent by Aeolus on request from Juno had scattered their fleet months earlier. It was hard time to remember Anchises, Aeneas' father, and funeral games were organized for the anniversary of his death. As the men were busy with sport competitions, Juno was still plotting. Her agreement with Venus had ended when Aeneas had left Carthage and Dido, and now she would do anything she could to stop Aeneas from reaching Italy, and found Rome. She sent her messenger, Iris, disguised as an old woman, to convince the Trojan women from the expedition to burn the fleet and this way prevent the Trojans from ever reaching Italy. But seeing that his ships were burning, Aeneas fell on his knees and prayed to Jupiter to quench the fires. The king of gods accepted and sent a rainstorm to save the fleet from complete destruction. But the gods don't do anything for free. In return for saving the fleet and for safe passage to Italy, Jupiter demanded one of Aeneas' men to be sacrificed to him. And shortly after, the helmsman of Aeneas' ship was claimed as the prize. He was put to sleep at night by the god of sleep, Somnus, and fell overboard. Jupiter had claimed his life. Before this, Aeneas had received a vision of his father, who had instructed him to go to the Underworld, where he would receive a vision of his future and Rome's future. Protected by Jupiter, the fleet had finally landed in Italy, near Cuma, a city close to Naples that did not exist yet. In this small city resided a powerful prophetess, a Sibyl, who presided over the oracle of Apollo. She could see glimpses of the future. She knew the ways of the gods, and she could travel to the Underworld. Aeneas asked for guidance in the journey to the Underworld he had to accomplish, and together they descended to the land of the dead. First, they passed by crowds of the dead by the banks of the river Acheron. To continue their journey, the dead had to pay Charon, the ferryman, to access the other bank. The ones who couldn't pay him had to wait for 1,000 years of loneliness and boredom before he would let them cross. But the Sibyl knew these lands and paid Charon, so they could swiftly cross and pass in front of Cerberus, the giant three-headed hound that guarded the underworld. Very few living ever visited the underworld, and even fewer returned. But Aeneas had this privilege. First, he could see Tartarus, where the wicked are kept prisoner and suffer for eternity. The Sibyl warned him to always bow to the justice of the gods if he didn't want to end there. And Aeneas was glad he had abandoned Carthage and followed the gods' orders until then. Then he was brought to the green fields of Elysium, where those who are worthy can spend an eternity of joy and peace. He was happy to find the spirit of his father Anchises there, and he was offered a prophetic vision of the destiny of Rome. Not just a city, not a kingdom, but an universal empire destined to cover the entire world. After this, Aeneas and the Sibyl returned to the world of the living. Aeneas had found inspiration in the underworld. His expedition had reached Italy, and now it was time to found this new city that the gods had envisioned. Upon returning to our world, Aeneas led the Trojans to the north, to the region of Latium, where he decided they would settle. But the region was not empty. A kingdom dominated it, the kingdom of the Latins. At his head was King Latinus, and he had a daughter, Lavinia. Lavinia had been promised to Turnus, the ruler of another native people, the Rutuli. But before the Trojans arrived in Latium, Latinus had been sent oracles announcing the arrival of foreigners and instructing him to marry his daughter to the newcomers, not to Turnus. The gods had made preparations to facilitate the settlement of the Trojans. But Juno was still watching and was displeased with the Trojans' favorable situation. Aeneas was now close to peacefully accomplish his mission. So she summoned the Fury, a deity of vengeance from the underworld, to stir up a war between the Trojans and the locals. The Fury incited the queen of Latium, the wife of Latinus, to demand that her daughter Lavinia be married to Turnus of the Rutuli. And the Fury also caused the son of Aeneas, Ascanius, to wound the sacred deer, sacred to the Rutuli, during a hunt. And the plan worked. Despite Aeneas' hopes of avoiding a war, hostilities broke out between the Rutuli and the Trojans. A long and merciless war would ravage Latium. the Trojans were too few, and so Aeneas searched for allies. In a dream, he was encouraged to seek help from the Tuscans, enemies of the Rutuli, and their king Turnus. The Tuscans accepted to fight alongside the Trojans, and so did a group of Greeks, the Arcadians, that Aeneas met at the place where Rome would one day be. But at the time, only 7 hills dominated the landscape. The Rutuli also had allies of their own, especially Amazon warriors, fearless women devoted to Diana, who excelled at warfare, and their leader, Camilla. Venus was also looking after her son. She asked her husband, Vulcan, the god of craftsmen, to create weapons for Aeneas, and she gifted her beloved son with the weapons. Once again, Juno was throwing her weight in the balance. She discreetly informed Turnus, the enemy king, that Aeneas was away from his camp, and that the moment was right to attack the Trojans. Turnus led an expedition to the camp. He could breach the gates, but the Trojans had been toughened by years of adventures, and they could force the Rutuli king and his men to retreat. But this was only a skirmish. The real battle was coming, and it didn't take place only in Latium. In the realm of gods, Juno and Venus pleaded to Jupiter with passion for the right to intervene or have the gods settle the war in favor of their preferred side. Jupiter ruled that Aeneas and the Trojans had to once again prove their worth, and the goddesses had to watch events without further intervention. On the ground, Aeneas had returned to his camp with his Tuscan and Arcadian allies, and a large battle ensued. The battle lasted for a very long time. Prominent warriors fell on both sides, but it was inconclusive, and a temporary armistice, a truce, was agreed upon for each side to bury and honor their dead. As soon as the truce ended, the battle resumed, and soon the leader of the Amazons, Camilla, fell. But still the battle was undecided, and as a way to stop the bloodshed, a new truce and the idea of a single combat, a duel between Aeneas and Turnus, circulated. But Aeneas was individually so superior to Turnus that the Rutuli knew their king wouldn't stand a chance. So they broke the truce again. Finally, Aeneas could force Turnus into single combat, and the king of the Rutuli lost this fight. And this is the end, because the Aeneid was most probably left unfinished. Some of the last lines are incomplete, and there is no proper conclusion, even though the text certainly ended near the conclusion that Virgil wished for. By winning his duel with Turnus, Aeneas granted victory to the Trojans and their allies, meaning that the way was now free for them to found their city in Latium, and on these foundations the Roman kingdom, republic and empire will flourish. Their descendants will include Romulus and Remus, and crossed the centuries to form the patrician families of ancient Rome, such as the gens Julia, the family of Julius Caesar, and Augustus, his adoptive son. The merger of Italic people with the Trojans will create the Romans. These new people could to inhabit and rule from the most extraordinary city ever built. We have reached the end of our journey for tonight. I will now let you enjoy the sweet sound of the crackling fire, and I'll talk to you soon with another story that this time will take us to mysteries hidden in Paris. But in the meantime, sleep well. Sweet dreams.